feel like we have to look at the back. Like it can't be two.
Okay, welcome everyone to the American Red Cross in Greater New York. My name is Josh Lockwood. I'm the very proud regional CEO of the American Red Cross in Greater New York. This happens to be the busiest area for the American Red Cross in the United States. And so in the center of it all, we are thrilled to also hold sessions like tonight for our humanitarian workforce, all the folks who come out and serve our mission each and every day. And as a bit of a tribute to our workforce, could everyone here who has ever volunteered for the Red Cross, please raise your hand? Okay. I just want to mention that 95% of our workforce at the American Red Cross is volunteers. It's the lifeblood of who we are and what we do, that humanitarian impulse. And when we were planning for tonight, we thought, oh, we just invite, we send something out to the volunteers to get first dibs and then have other folks be able to RSVP later. And what we found that our volunteers pretty much took over the whole space for us. So I think it just speaks to the big-hearted nature of that workforce. But we're also not surprised to have such a great turnout and such a great response because of the incredible topic and our esteemed guests that have gathered with us here tonight. We have panelists tonight that will be speaking to you who are coming from the front lines of the European migration crisis. These are experts in the field who bring on-the-ground knowledge and expertise to this incredible, catastrophic challenge that is facing humanitarians across the world. And I want to thank the panel who will be introduced just in a moment by our moderator, Médecins. We've worked on pronouncing his name correctly. And Dr. Spoerri will be introducing them in a moment. But it means so much to us at the Red Cross to have you convening here with us today. So thank you for joining us. For those of you not as familiar with the American Red Cross is one Red Cross society among 190 across the world. And we are bound together by some shared fundamental principles about what it means to be a humanitarian. But it is not just the principles that bind us together, it is our work in action. And to give you just a flavor of that, here in the United States, the American Red Cross responds to 70,000 disasters a year. We had a 48-hour period last week just in the New York City area where we had 42 disaster responses in one 48-hour period. That's everything from a single-family home fire to a building collapse to a flood. And in every one of these instances, we see our fellow citizens or people in need, our neighbors, running for their lives at a moment's notice, seeking help. And who are they met with but a kind-hearted American Red Cross volunteer saying, it's going to be okay, I'm here to help, we're going to get you through these next couple of days. That work goes around us every 9 minutes. There's a disaster response in the United States. In addition, many of you know we collect 40% of the nation's life-saving blood supply. So we are active in doing that every day. We teach hundreds of thousands of people life-saving skills across the United States. So our mission to alleviate suffering and save lives is embodied in so many of you in this room each and every day. It's something we're incredibly proud of. Some folks don't know that we have a terrific relationship with other Red Cross societies throughout the world. And in some instances, such as the European migration crisis, the Red Cross in America is asked to step up to provide volunteers, technical assistance, and fundraise dollars to support a humanitarian response. We are proud to be doing that in Europe right now. We have many wonderful supporters giving any amount of money from $1 to much more from individuals and corporations, and all of that is supporting efforts out in the field. We join many other not-for-profits, including those incredible organizations and individuals that are with us on the panel tonight to serve our neighbors in need throughout the world, and specifically in the wake of the European migration crisis. But for all of you who are supporting the Red Cross mission or humanitarian efforts in general, we at the Red Cross want to give you a big thank you, so thank you. I want to introduce our moderator tonight. Oh, sorry. That's one who's raising her I want to introduce our moderator tonight, but before I do, I wanted to give one shout out on a staff level. The person who organized tonight's panel is Marie Van de Vet. Marie is actually it's her last day. Is that right? It's our last day today with the American Red Cross in Greater New York. She is moving back to Europe, and we are so sad to see her go. But I think this is a very nice farewell for you to be able to convene us all and to have a session. So thank you, Marie, for your efforts. So Dr. Mehdi Bezorgner is currently a distinguished fellow at CUNY Graduate Center's Advanced Research Collaborative. Born in Tehran, he came to the United States as a foreign university student, eventually receiving his PhD from UCLA. He specializes in international migration with a focus on Middle Easterners and Muslims in the West. He was the founding co-director of the Middle East and Middle Eastern American Center at CUNY Graduate Center from 2001 to 2013. We're thrilled to have him kick off the panel tonight. Mehdi.
This is Dr. Mehdi. I'm calling Josh. Thank you, Josh. All that about the distinguished fellow means that I'm not teaching this semester, which also I missed it, ironically, and it's really great to see such a large young audience here. But I promised not to lecture today. I'm here to listen because we have such a distinguished panel here. What I will do is that the order of the day is to basically first ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves in a few minutes, say something about their organization, and then we are going to get to the more substantive part and ask about questions related to issues. So the first panelist is Mr. Ashraf Nour, who is the Permanent Observer of the International Organization for Migration, IOM, to the UN. I urge you to look at the bios in the leaflet that was there. Skip mine because you're already there.
Well, thank you, Mehdi, and let me extend my thanks to Josh for the invite and for the opportunity to be with all of you this evening. This is really an important discussion that we are going to have today on the European crisis, the response, and the role that is played by the different agencies. I am very pleased to represent my organization, the International Organization for Migration, IOM. I happen to be the permanent observer to the UN, but before coming here, I was also in the field. And I saw that the way that, as was mentioned earlier, we happen to be in the front line responding to many of the migration hotspots around the world. So this is the experience that I have. And this is what I want to share with you as I speak about the European migration situation, the response as we see working with organizations on the ground, but also governments and host communities, some of the challenges that are being faced, the numbers and the complexities that we confront, and also share some of my reflections and maybe put some recommendation for your consideration and for the discussion that would follow. So with that understanding, let me just say that Europe in 2015 became a major destination for large movements of refugees and migrants. It received by the end of the year an estimated number of more than 1 million people. They traveled across the Mediterranean, mainly from countries neighboring Europe to the east and south. These are people who have been under tremendous pressure because of different pull factors, and many of them, they decided that they will be on the move, and they reached the point of no return because of loss of hope and desperation. This is the situation that more or less we are dealing with. The migration of people and the flows across the Mediterranean into Europe is not a new phenomenon. And what is surprising that the response has been less than adequate, to put it bluntly. And this is for a number of reasons. The first reason, we have seen that there is a continuous failure to address the root causes and the drivers of migration. This is one. The second, we saw that the response systems in the different migration regimes in Europe and across the European area in terms of dealing with asylum and immigrants coming in were ineffective. And they were quickly knocked off and overwhelmed by the numbers that started to come. And last but not least, we saw, unfortunately, lack of what we call the political leadership and courage, with a few exceptions. We know what I'm talking about. And that said, European Union quickly became overwhelmed with the crisis because we saw that the situation is worsening, and the crisis in Syria itself continues to deepen, and with that, many more and more people became more determined to reach Europe. And not only to reach Europe, they were more prepared to put their hands, to put their money and also lives in the hands of traffickers and human smugglers who took advantage of the situation. And the situation started to worsen, and it became the challenge not only for Europe and its borders, but also to the rest of the world, because it added quickly to the migration hotspots that we saw spreading in other parts of the world, from the Andaman Sea to the Bay of Bengal, to the Gulf of Aden, to the Central America, Caribbean. In many of these places in 2015, we saw hotspots just going from one place to another, and the response more or less was on a firefighting mode. And unfortunately, this happened at the time it became clear that migrants are the most vulnerable because they move with less information. They, in many cases, they are ill prepared for the move. The protection systems and the instruments that would respect their dignity and their rights, very often they fall apart and they fall through the crack. And on top of that comes xenophobia and comes the toxic narrative on migration to make things more difficult for them. And at least we believe as an organization that Europe as a country, as a continent with more than 500 million, with abundant resources, with a strong tradition of democracy and partnership with the rest of the world, could really have done much better. But the response we saw more or less was a mix. And with that, we also saw this is all actually happening at the time that globally we see unprecedented levels of movement. One in every 7 people in the world today is already on the move. The number of those displaced globally are reaching levels that we didn't see since World War II. We are talking about 60 million people, including 20 million refugees and 40 million IDPs. And there are many others who have been uprooted by natural disasters. Many of them are recurrent, but also poverty, loss of jobs, loss of livelihoods. So the risk is really long. So the question now here comes.
I saw it as it's very polite to cut off permanent observers. But would you mind if we go to the other introductions and then we'll revisit you?
Sure.
Because you're already getting into some substantive stuff. Okay. And telling us that the number is very telling, the 60 million number. Sorry about that. My apologies. And the next speaker is Ms. Jo Frawley, who's field nurse for Doctors Without Borders. And I urge you to really read her bio. It's pretty incredible how great she is.
Hi, welcome. Bienvenue. Assalamu alaikum. Buenas noches. Those are only 3 welcomings that I was able to say this summer out of the 30 different countries of people that were on the move on our boat in the Mediterranean. I had the privilege and pleasure of being a team member of Doctors Without Borders on one of the search and rescue boats that worked off the coast of Libya and helped deliver those people, men, women, and children from all walks of life, to the open arms and hearts of the Italian Red Cross that was on the shore that we were able to hand and gracefully pass the love of those people on to their colleagues on the shores of Italy. So I'm here to help share some of my experience on the boat and to answer any questions anybody had about people on the boat. Thank you.
Thank you very much for keeping it so brief. We appreciate that. Next speaker, Mr. Philip Spoerri, Permanent Observer and Head of the Delegation of the International Committee for the Red Cross, ICRC.
Well, thank you, and first of all, also to Mary and Josh for having me here. It's really a great pleasure. I mean, I have the same job title as Ashraf, as the Permanent Observer of the International Committee to the UN. But as that, I spend my days at the UN with member states. But being a Red Crosser, this is an environment which is more natural probably to me. So I'm very, very happy to be with you this evening. And so, well, trying to keep it short, but 1-2 words. I mean, as Red Crossers, you should know what the ICRC is, or I hope. But I mean, nowadays, if I put it there, we're an organization present in 80 countries. It's usually within the system, national societies, the federation as the membership organization. Then you have the ICRC as the founding organization, but very much the organization specialized on armed conflict and violence. So where usually the shooting is, that's where one should find us. And that's why I say it. I mean, nowadays we are at record heights since the Second World War in terms of activities. It's just staggering, the response we have. Normally, we would not be the first component of the movement, National Societies Federation, where one would say migration, ICRC. It's not necessarily us who one thinks of, but we are getting more and more involved in the issue. There is an overall movement policy where we have all agreed together, Federation, ICRC, on how to respond. We have this text since a couple of years, very, very important. But if I speak first for the ICRC, you would expect us in terms of migration, well, to be, and that's the first part, is where the problem starts, at the root causes in the countries where the fighting takes place. That's why we, of course, have a huge operation. If I just take the example of Syria, but you would find it all there. And it is at that point where, in terms of persons we're assisting, it's not the migrant, it's the displaced persons which we're assisting. We will be passing very strong messages to actually say the problem starts the countries of origin, then you have the transit countries and the arrival. We are at the origin, where you would already say if international humanitarian law were respected, if the people are assisted there, if you would be able to solve the conflicts, already at that point, a big part of the response would be done. And that's where we have the biggest response by the ICRC. But of course, the problem has become so overwhelming that the ICRC within the movement actually has a couple of roles where we have a sort of a lead role. One is, and that's a very important one, is the entire tracing work. Missing persons, separated people. There is all 119 national societies are connected through this ICRC-led network of tracing. And in all the context in the European crisis, that's an important activity that the ICRC supports national societies to do it. Another very important activity that we carry out or try, and we can have several examples, is either in some countries we're now directly also visiting some detention centers, or if not, where migrants can actually be held, or we actually help or support or train national societies in how one can approach also migrants who are held or detained. And there's also another sad specialty that we have and that's unfortunately the area of forensic dead body management. I just heard our president was in Greece last week to an official visit, looking what we can do, and then just knowing that you have over 3,000 bodies there which are not identified, and having to bring that type of work where we are also assisting. So that is one of the key areas where we are currently in these 3 areas, helping the overall movement response. But since I am not here, the Federation is not sitting up here, and all the national societies are not represented, it would be unfair just to speak of the role of the ICRC here. One has to bear in mind that in the overall response, if one just takes Europe, if you think of the scale of activity, just taking the Italian Red Cross, I mean, they are the ones in the various Lampedusa receiving first aid, psychosocial support. You'll have the same thing, Spanish side, as far as people come in. We see it in Greece, national society probably of a lesser extend in the scale of the operation as in Italy, but a huge response. I just heard if you take the 1 million refugees arriving in Germany, massive, of course, response in all areas of the German response. So you have this overall movement response with the ICRC getting more and more engaged, passing messages on the protection side and supporting the national societies with a number of activities. I would probably say that arguably, and I saw it like in Greece, even the ICRC will probably be asked to do even more and support national societies, even in some terms of assistance and other activities. So I keep it there.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And last but not least, Ms. Joan Timoney from Washington, D.C., who is the Senior Director of Advocacy and External Relations for the Women's Refugee Commission, WRC.
You can take mine.
Oh, excellent. That's why the RCRC is so helpful. I feel like I first have to say thank you to all of you, because I was thinking, as an American, we have an assumption if something bad happens to us, the American Red Cross is going to be there, right? And it is, but the reason it's there is because of volunteers like you. So I have to start with a special thank you for that. What I thought I would do quickly in this opening is just very quickly explain what the Women's Commission does, and then what took us into to Europe recently to look at the situation for women and girls. So the Women's Refugee Commission, we are a research and advocacy organization. We're headquartered here in New York. And our focus is what's needed to protect the rights of women, children, and youth forced from their homes by crises. What's needed to ensure that they're safe, healthy, and self-reliant. And for us, that's looking at what are the right policies, what are the right programs, what kinds of tools might humanitarian workers need to carry out those programs, what kind of funding is needed. So it's identifying the problems, helping to identify the resources to address them, and advocating like heck for all of that. We've always had a special focus on women and girls. And as all of you know, women and girls are at especially high risk during flight, during displacement, when all the protections that come from family and community break down or are destroyed or whatever. So that's always been a major area of focus for us. And to give you an example of the kinds of things we look at, it's everything from are the basic life-saving reproductive health services in place at the start of an emergency? Everything from care for pregnant women to care for survivors of gender-based violence, the emergency care that should be in place there. We look at how do you mitigate the risks of sexual and gender-based violence. I think as many of you know, how we deliver assistance can exacerbate or reduce risk. So for example, are shelters safe for women and girls as well as men and boys? How are food distributions carried out? Have you taken into account what it means to do it in a way that women and girls can access it, that they can carry the food safely, and so on? So that's the kind of work that we do, and that's the lens we really brought to the crisis in Europe. And as the crisis was growing in 2015, I think we were all struck by really the lack of any kind of mention or seeming awareness of what was going on for women and girls, and what might be put in place or not along the route to ensure their safety. And as we know, those routes are treacherous, right? And you mentioned, sir, it's treacherous whether you're trying to go from Central America to the US, whether you're trying to go from Syria or to Iraq and make your way through Europe. And yet there really wasn't much attention to women and children. And so we decided that we wanted to go and assess the situation, take a look at what the gaps are and what might be needed to done to address them. So in the middle part of our session, I'll be talking about missions we did in November of 2015 with the first one with UNHCR, the Refugee Agency, and the United Nations Population Fund. The second one we did in December to Serbia and Slovenia. That was ourselves. And my colleagues who did those missions are actually now in Germany and then Sweden, so that we can look at what it looks like along the route. And I'll just preview that our findings were pretty alarming in terms of the risks along the route and the lack of services that are in place, or the lack of programming that's in place to mitigate those risks. And so we can talk in more detail about that, I think, in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fabulous introduction. Now we'll just look at the different perspectives of different presenters, and then at the end we'll open to Q&A. I guess the first issue for Mr. Nour and for IOM is that most of these refugees originate from sort of several source societies. So perhaps if you could talk about precipitating factors for refugee outflow. And what we hear in the news a lot is the routes that they take. I mean, a lot of debates is about the routes, about blockage of the routes and things like that. And of course, what the destinations are, what is the sort of the thing. If you can speak to that issue, that would be very useful.
Well, thank you. And indeed, this is the issue that would help us to frame the challenges that we are dealing with and look much better into the responses that go into them. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2015, Europe received more than 1 million people who came from different countries. They mostly arrived into Turkey, and from Turkey they went into Greece. Looking at the numbers that went into Greece, they're estimated to be 850,000. So out of the 850,000, 57% came from Syria, which means that the conflict in Syria is the main driver for populations to go out of Syria, but also let us not forget those who have been displaced within Syria. I think we are talking about more than 6 million people who are internally displaced within Syria. We are talking about also close to 4 or 5 million Syrian refugees that are in neighboring countries, from Lebanon to Jordan to Turkey, and the rest went beyond that. The other figure that I would like to share is of the Afghans, who are estimated to be 24% of the 750 that went into Greece. Again, I could see that Afghanistan is still not a stable country, a protracted crisis for different reasons. Many people are coming out not only because of hotspots of instability, but loss of livelihood, loss of opportunity. So it's a mix of conflict, of poverty, and of other push factors. And not necessarily all of them are coming out of Afghanistan. Many are coming from their second country of asylum or refugee, be it Pakistan or Iran or others. The third category is the Iraqis, who are estimated to be 10% of the 750. The reasons for the Iraqis also goes to the conflict in Iraq. And there is more than one conflict in Iraq. Actually, Iraq since 1991 has been in a situation of protracted conflicts. One conflict leads to the other. And the rest comes from what we call refugee-producing countries. The exceptions are a few, those who come for economic reasons. Actually, in total, 90% of those who come into Europe, they come from refugee-producing countries. The route that they take, there are 3 different main routes. If I look at the Mediterranean, we have the Central Mediterranean route, and this is the route that starts somewhere in terms of origin countries in the Horn of Africa or in West Africa, and we see the flows coming into Libya mainly, and especially now Libya for some time actually, because of the stabilization that happened there, and the estimated number of stranded migrants in that country as we speak is estimated to be around 300,000 people. And many of them, especially those coming from the Horn, Eritrea is thought to be one important source country, it's a major portion of those who come out, followed by Syria. Although the Syrians are not coming from Syria directly, they come to the Horn, to Sudan, or through Egypt, and then they come to Libya, and there are others. And until the end of 2014, actually the numbers that were coming through the Eastern Mediterranean route, which is Libya, then into Italy. I had Lampedusa before, this is one of the areas through which people come, but also Malta. They seem to be, on the high side, estimated to be 150, 170, 2013, 2014. But in 2015, they were quickly overtaken by the Eastern Mediterranean route and the West Balkan. This is where mainly the Syrians comes in, and I mentioned the figure of 750,000 who went into Turkey, and from Turkey they crossed into Greece. The others, which is not really a small number of those who come across the Western Mediterranean route. This is into Spain and through Morocco, the Maghreb countries. But we are talking about a few samples. So destinations, initially it used to be countries, neighboring countries, but they have become over time overflown that comes there with the numbers of refugees and comes there more or less in a situation where you have large number of population and humanitarian responses become overstretched. Funding is not as it used to be. So many of these refugee camps and displacement areas, they became also in a way pushing refugees and others to continue their journeys to other places. So Turkey became the stepping stone into Europe and from there into Greece.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very, very useful and very informative. And I just watched something which I urge you to look at International Organization, Migration Policy Institute. The director, Dimitri Papadimitriou, who is now heading the Migration Policy Institute office in Europe, and has a really, really great video where he discusses the routes of migrants and the source countries and the destinations. I urge you to look at that. It's very, very important and useful. Not, of course, as informative as Mr. Nour's, but a nice supplement. So perhaps again to set the broad stage, maybe I would ask Mr. Spoerri to talk about something that's quite controversial, actually, something that I've even dealt with, in my sort of meager attempts in looking at the differences between political refugees and economic migrants. Could you speak to that issue? Because there's quite a bit of controversy about whether these migrants, as the one that Mr. Nour referred to, constitute political refugees, or are they economic migrants? Are they leaving because of fear of persecution, or are they seeking jobs in the destination countries? And how that relates to the whole issue of IHL.
Okay, well, I'll just try to make a few points of it. I mean, Mr. Nour, Ashraf, he made the principal point is that already the terminology used with regard to what is happening is to some extent misleading, because if you're speaking about the migration crisis, I mean, what we're seeing, if you just the figures mentioned, that up to 90% are actually people fleeing from conflict, and you can see already that it's the tip of the iceberg. So it's more generally a refugee crisis, if one wanted to be exact on it. But if I make a lapse a little bit into sort of movement parlance, and I was mentioning our own sort of Red Cross, Red Crescent movement parts, we, for example, with regard, we use the migration as a broader term which encompasses all refugees and people, illegal, legal migrants, however you want to call them, and say in terms of humanitarian response, we basically don't care. We respond simply to the vulnerabilities, because not every, depending on whatever status you have, you might be well off or not so. So it's most of all looking at vulnerabilities as a response measure. However, we do, of course, recognize that there are important legal distinctions that can be made. And in particular, a person fleeing as a refugee, and there you have the Refugee Convention, who says that people fleeing for various causes, but in particular, if you're taking the cause fleeing from conflict, it's too dangerous to stay where you are. Yes, you have a right of asylum. So these people have a right to stay, and that is, of course, one of the big problems nowadays that you can see with the numbers and the discussions that are in place, that, of course, also the UNHCR has to really fight to preserve this very important institution of people staying on the spot. But despite the large part having a type of, a refugee status, you have, of course, for all other persons, you will always have other important legal institutes, like one is in the French term called the principle of non-refoulement, meaning that whatever person or whatever status is, if he's to fear that back home he will be tortured or abused another way, the country is not allowed to send them back. So these people, even if they're not qualified, some as a refugee, doesn't mean you can just send them back. So they all deserve different forms of protection. But again, you have the refugees with a very distinct international law rights, which they have. But all the others whatever stuff you can legal. I mean, you still have migrants who are going to have jobs, and there are ways to come into the United States to work which are perfectly legal, and you could call these people migrants, but there are legal ways to do it. And then you will have illegal ones coming. They don't have any work permits, no ways to do, and you know the broad discussion here. But even for those people, I mean, they have safeguards under national law. There are human rights standards that apply. If these people are detained, they have to be respected. There are certain standards that have to be preserved. And that's why I was referring to, for example, the work the ICRC would do in detention places, also making sure that these rights are observed. So you have these discussions around sort of the status, but in spite of that, you have sort of a general desire for humanitarians to make sure that these people are well treated and their specific needs are taken care of. So I keep it there.
Fantastic. So in short, all refugees are migrants, but not all migrants are refugees. Okay, that's sort of a summary of
Ashraf maybe wants to add something.
Analysis.
But maybe wait. Sorry, I missed the point. Sorry, I'm being short. I mean, if you take the ICRC perspective, also now speaking of the context, like say we're in Syria, or even in some of the conflicts, you will have migrants coming into the country. And when you are in conflict zones, these people, in addition to their rights, they have refugee conventions. They will also have the rights of respect that stem from international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, which applies in those contexts, and that also have to be respected. So that's an additional legal framework that deserves to
If
be
I
mentioned.
may interject something quickly, I find that historical context tells the story very well as well. If you look at Syria, say 6 years ago, before the crisis started, there were not many people leaving. You know, few were leaving, right, and coming to different sort of destinations. But all of a sudden, you see the crisis, and you see this incredible outpouring of the society. Virtually half of the population of Syria is displaced, whether internally or externally. And this is really, really astonishing. And this is a sort of a historical crisis that sort of facilitates these refugee flows. So that's one issue. The other issue is that the destination countries, when migrants or refugees are going to destination countries that have literally no connection to their historical past, that's really a function of refugee flow. So for instance, Syrians going to Germany. Syrians should be coming to the US because this is, after all, one of the major destinations of Syrians. Or Syrians should be going to Latin America. Why are they going to Germany and Sweden? Okay. The reason for that is because these are host societies that are tolerant, that have open refugee policies, that the few exceptions that Mr. Nour mentioned is dropped. Ergo was one of those who was only the example. Would you like to add something?
If I may add, IOM defines mixed migratory flows as complex population movements involving refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. They come from different countries, different backgrounds, and they happen to be part of the same movements. And in order to provide them with the needed protection and assistance, you need to profile them, determine their needs, and tailor their assistance according to each situation. And if so, I think it's important to emphasize the importance of avoiding oversimplification of the issue. Because the way it is presented now is like refugees versus migrants. But if I look at the migrants, I'm looking not just at the numbers, but I'm looking at different people with different needs and vulnerabilities. We are talking about those who are in situation of human trafficking, those who have been smuggled. We are talking about minors, separated children, pregnant women. So the list is really long. So oversimplification needs to be avoided in order to give more effective protection and assistance. The second issue that we emphasize is the importance that whoever is in a migratory situation needs to be assisted and protected regardless of their legal status. Legal status should not be a precondition for assisting this or that. And certainly when it comes to that, the selection policies that we see now, which seem to emphasize that only certain nationalities or certain categories of the people, is something that is certainly not consistent with the existing instruments and laws. And thirdly, we also emphasize the importance that in any approach to deal with issues like this needs to be right-based and emphasize respect and dignity of the people involved.
Thank you very much. this is a broad context, but let's hear sort of the hands-on, in the field stories from Ms. Frawley. Would you tell us about something? I can't really put any finger on it. Would you tell us about your experiences? What are some of the highlights of your experience?
Thank you very much. Sure. My outside folder. Thank you very much. My experience with people on the move was a very precious and a very memorable experience. Differentiating between refugees and migrants. Many people are seeking safety and security for both them and their family, men, women, and children. MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, is a non-government organization that serves medical needs, serves medical or mental health issues, water and sanitation issues in many of the countries that these folks have come from. Sudan, Darfur, Kano, Nigeria, Halabia, Syria, Kismayo, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia. I've been in those countries, and we have also, MSF and Doctors Without Borders are in those countries now providing emergency supplies. Probably one of the most impressive moments for me was that young man that came on the boat, and there's no coincidence that I'm sitting beside a Sudanese man tonight from one of our camps in Darfur that I was with and working in 2004. And he remembers MSF, he remembers Doctors Without Borders, he remembers the international ICRC coming and doing surgery there. He remembers having those kind of connections, those kind of support, remembers those kind of things. And that really brought it home for me, remembering what it was like to be in those camps back in 2004 in North Sudan. Some very difficult times for people. I think that for me was making that heartfelt connection with people in countries that we're working in, countries that we're still struggling to provide safety and security for people, and struggling with our colleagues here at the table and providing the right thing for folks. So I'm very privileged to be a part of this table. I've been a part of ICRC's surgical programs in the field, working hand in hand in Darfur and complicated situations. I've been a part of the Red Cross and the Federation in Haiti. I've been a part of all of those organizations that have provided training for the vaccinators. I just came back from South Sudan, where we also are experiencing some dramatic experiences there. But if it wasn't for those trained volunteers on the field and working as a team on the ground, it would be a different story.
I'd like to actually ask you a personal question. What motivated you to get into this in the first place? I find this pretty incredibly compelling.
It's an opportunity and a privilege of a lifetime. It's the opportunity to provide medical care. It's the opportunity to be in conversation. It's the opportunity to just be sitting beside somebody and sharing a cup of coffee or tea, and to just be a part of their journey. To be able to welcome you here at this event, to be able to welcome somebody onto the boat, to see the transformation that happens in 48 hours, and to be able to see their light come on and their feelings of hope will wake up. Everybody here knows what it's like when you've seen somebody at the first moment of the critical incident that you're in, and you see them after that first cup of coffee, and they've been able to warm up, settle down, and get real. That's what it's about. That's why I don't know if anybody has. I can't imagine that you wouldn't be here if you haven't experienced that before. So that's just about taking it locally to a different level. So I think we all share that heartfelt connection.
Not many of us have the guts to do it, including me for sure. Okay, so
Thank you.
Ms. Timoney, if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit about specifically what happens to women and children.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I thought I'd just pull out some of the key findings from the two missions that we made. And the other thing I wanted to, before I get into that, just point out is that I think UNHCR said that in January that something like 55% of those arriving now were women and children. And so I think, which was greatly changed from months earlier when it was largely male. And so I think as we think about what's needed for women and girls, women and children, it should happen under any circumstance, and then it becomes even more imperative when you begin to look at the increased numbers too. And I was thinking, if you think about what people have been through, if you think about that journey and they finally get there, to then think that there might not be the right services and basic protection in place as you try to move is heartbreaking, I think. And there's the moral humanitarian obligation to make sure those basic things are in place. Unfortunately, what we in the places that we visited, I'll just give you some of the highlights, but the transit sites that we visited didn't offer basic services or protection for women and girls. Some of the most elementary things, showers and latrines were rarely separated by sex, for example. And my colleagues talked to women and girls who really didn't want to eat or drink because they didn't want to have to use the latrines because they were afraid. I mean, no female-specific shelters, no dignity kits. Dignity kits are sort of a classic fundamental piece of humanitarian response. It would include things like menstrual supplies and so on. Some were available sometimes, sometimes not. So it was sporadic, but often you had to ask for it. And so if it's only men, for example, working in a given area and you have to ask a man, probably the woman's not going to do that, right? So that was another thing we saw. A general lack of information, sometimes about where you are, what to expect, what comes next. So not good information and not available in the languages that people speak. So not enough interpreters, and then most importantly, when you're thinking about women and girls, not enough female interpreters, if any. Discrimination by nationality. We were talking, I know you all probably read that if in some places, if you're not Syrian or Iraqi, you can't advance, right? So think about if you're from East Africa or West Africa, somehow you've made your way to a certain point and you can go no further. Think about your vulnerability, right? And what you're prey to in terms of violence, in terms of smugglers, trafficking, the whole thing, right? And in fact, my colleagues met a woman from West Africa, and she had fled because her brother was killed and her sister went missing. So she was afraid for her own life. So she flees, but she's blocked because she's from a West African country. She's not allowed to move forward. And on this journey, she was forced to have sex twice, once to have a passport and once to get on the boat, right? And now there she is, stuck. So you have the vulnerabilities for some people that can't move on too. We didn't find very good reproductive health services in place at the transit sites, yet you have a large number of pregnant women. And so that was another issue. The good news was UNFPA was beginning to deploy some mobile clinics, and maybe we can talk about that in the third part when we talk about going forward. But in general, reproductive health services were not available on the transit sites. And if they were available nearby, no one knew how to get there, right? In fact, there was a pregnant woman sitting on the train platform, and she was really ill, and she needed help. And she would not leave that platform because she was afraid she would miss the train. So she didn't know that the train wasn't going to come for 5 hours and that there were services nearby, but she didn't know that. And so we were able to help her, my colleagues were, but again, that basic lack of information, not knowing what your options are, and not knowing that in fact, in this case, there was medical care and she had time to go see a doctor. So things like that. Gender-based violence, look, it happens, I mean, for some number of the women, it happened to them before they left, or it may have happened en route, or it's happening now. And again, those basic things that are supposed to be in place to care for survivors, the emergency medical care, emergency contraception, HIV protection, sexually transmitted diseases, all of that, not really in place. Post-rape kits not pre-positioned, workers not familiar with what to do appropriately, if you do, what to look for, and then if you do meet a survivor, what to do. No private spaces where women could comfortably disclose something. And I think just to sort of sum up, I think what we found was an attitude of, look, in the countries that we visited, people are moving quickly, they're moving on, they don't want to stop, we can't provide anything. And I think what our conclusion is, that is true, people want to move, people are worried about stopping, but I think what we need to do is be more creative and think about how we meet the needs of people on the move and moving quickly. You can't say, can't do anything moving too fast. The moral, the humanitarian obligation is to figure out what to do. And I think there are things we can do, and we can talk about that maybe in the next session, but it isn't enough to say not much we can do. So I think I'll just
That's what
stop
we're going to
there.
talk about in
Yeah.
the next
And
session.
that's the next part, right.
So if you could tell us how we can move forward, and how the rest of us can help. We can start with you since you're already on the roll. If you don't mind talking about 5 minutes.
You know, there you go. So here's my sum up. Recommendations. Look, there's no reason that transit sites can't be established or configured in a way that meets the basic standards for safety, right? Those guidelines are well known. It's a question of making sure people know what they are and train them in it. But you ought to be able to make them safe places for women and girls. We need to ensure that basic gender services to treat survivors are in place. Again, we know what those are. We have to deploy more gender-based violence experts to help. In Serbia and Slovenia in particular, there are certainly local organizations that have this kind of expertise, but they're not able to access the refugees presently. So some of it is making sure that those local organizations that are experts have a way to help, and not all of them do right now. We have to find a way too to set up some mechanisms so that as people move, information travels with them. And as an example, there was a terrific civil society organization in Serbia that was helping survivors of gender-based violence. And what they had done was created this informal mechanism to hook up the women that they had helped with their sister organizations in Germany, so that there would be, in a sense, a handoff, and also so the women don't have to keep telling the story over and over again to somebody that's new. So that was just happening informally, and I think one of our recommendations is we have to establish those mechanisms more formally and make sure they work across borders. We've talked with UNFPA, as I said, they're deploying mobile clinics to get the RH services there, reproductive health services there, and what we would say is, in order to meet the needs of people on the move, we have to find a way to make those clinics available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? It can't be a few days a week. That's not going to work for the way people are moving. So again, it's thinking, how do we do what needs to be done given the way people are moving? And then all the issues around access to information. Step up the interpretation, make sure you have it in the languages that people speak. And again, allow those local organizations that do have expertise, allow them to come in and help. That's a quick thumbnail.
You don't have to be so quick if you like to elaborate, or we come back to you. Which one would you prefer? We can come back.
Okay.
Mrs. Spoerri, would you like to?
So looking forward, that's
Yes.
well, I think this one we're doing now. Well, I mean, looking forward, I mean, the first message was one that I already mentioned, and that was more in the area of the root causes, is because we're seeing so many conflicts that are escalating and not coming to a stop. I mean, we've seen now, of course, in Syria, we'll see on Saturday what happens with first sort of ceasefire or how it goes. But for the moment, the past years, we've just seen things getting worse. So obviously, and that's where it links to the type of work one also has in New York and other places, is really putting pressure at the political side to find political solutions, because the humanitarians will not find the solution to these problems. I mean, we're running behind, and the needs are always bigger, but it doesn't solve the problem. These are remedies. So I think the pressure is really on the preventive side and on the political side of it very, very, very strongly. But the other message is then more, for example, that's international humanitarian law, that is even in the countries where this is coming out, to really, really work for the respect for the law. Even in armed conflicts, we're seeing so many violations that are driving people out. So there would even, if some rules were respected, there might be in places reasons that even though one is in a conflict country, that people might not leave. So there's also looking at what are drivers specifically that make people go, and see whether some things can be addressed. Because sometimes when one looks at why the people go, it might also be that they're fearing their kids will not have an education, but maybe there is something one can still do in some areas to keep people from moving. So I think there is a big issue of respect for the law. But then I think the rest remains very much, and that's where if you take the Red Cross, Red Crescent response, I mean, our advantage is that we're at all places, origin, transit, and at the destination spot. We had a big conference in Geneva, the Red Cross Red Crescent conference in December, where there were also a lot of lessons learned and sharing of what has been done over the past years. And there are magnificent examples of what some national societies are doing. But you could obviously arguably say that there are probably a lot of things where we still actually can do a lot more. I saw, again, just the outcomes of our president's visit, for example, in Greece. And I think that, for example, there altogether, there is still a lot more. There are other actors doing it, but even there, from national societies, from the Federation and the ICRC, there's still scales of different activities where we can scale up. And I think we're still in days where we will have to scale up and bring together our collective knowledge, being able to draw from the various experiences all throughout Europe, but also the experiences on the migration issue that comes now from many other contexts where we have some lessons learned that we could bring in and bring the added value of the movement there.
Thank you very much, and that's a very comprehensive overview. And of course, the crisis, particularly in the Middle East, seems to be the driver, the major driver. And in fact, even in the wake of any kind of a peace sort of rapprochement or something, the violence escalates because they know they don't have enough chance to kill each other, so they go ahead and faster. Nour, would you mind saying something about sort of something positive out of this very kind of depressing and gloomy kind of a picture?
Thank you. To look forward, it's important to look back, find out what went wrong and what were the specific challenges that faced Europe, but also globally. And looking at the challenges that faced Europe, one could list that in response to the crisis, the European went into what I would call crisis mode, in a state of migration management mode. And the result of that has been chaotic, has been disjointed initiatives and measures, which resulted in the fragmentation of the movement and also pushing more and more people into the hands of smugglers and traffickers. Because when you start building walls, when you start making restrictions, you are also creating a market for smugglers and others to take advantage of that. So this is one. Secondly, we recognize that when this happened, European Union has, in many instances, they have been meeting in different places, different times, but throughout we saw that there has been a continuous backtracking of commitments, the implementation of the agreement that reached. Examples of that, there was a quota on redistribution among the European countries that has not been found anywhere. As far as I see from the numbers that I know, only 461 have been, actually 259 of them from the East and 202 from Italy, sorry. 259 from Italy and 202 from Greece. And that is all. Okay? There is also a discussion about the order for resettlement, 120,000, in Greece 260, and very little has taken place on that. So what it started as a crisis of numbers became eventually a crisis of solidarity among the Europeans. So thirdly, we saw that as a result of this disjointed and fragmentation among the European countries, that actually put at risk one of the pillars of the European Union, which is the Schengen project. The European is standing on only 2 feet or 2 pillars. One would be the euro, and the other one would be the Schengen area. And the Schengen area came at huge pressure since the start of this crisis. Many countries started talking about reinstating borders, putting more border controls and all that. And in my view, this trend continued, especially at the time that even the euro itself has been under pressure since the time of the financial crisis in 2008. Then the basis of that model, which is also not only a model for Europe, it has been a model for the rest of the world in terms of the movement. And it is starting to not work the way it is. I don't think this is the positive message that we want to see going on. The other thing that the European response has also been more or less business as usual. By business as usual, I mean putting more walls, doing patrolling at sea, trying to close their borders, and this is a thing that they have been doing forever, and it took them nowhere to this country or that country, and we spend years on those, and then that was it. And yet, if you look at the money that is spent, just last year alone, Europe spent 2.5 billion just on business as usual. So we are saying that this does not take you far. A law enforcement approach alone, and unilateral measures do not work. You need to bring a development dimension to this. You need to bring inclusive measures that would include, transit, source countries, etc. And what makes this all more difficult now, this is my other point, is the xenophobic, rise that we see. Migration narrative has become toxic, negative, etc. With a lot of politicization, and even the security concerns add to the mess. So to make things even more difficult. So this is the situation as far as Europe. Globally, there are also concerns and implications because we have seen not only in as far as Europe is concerned, but in other migration hotspots that the migration dimension of crisis is always overlooked and only comes as afterthought. Only when the numbers start knocking the doors, and then we start to try to go into a firefighting mode, which again is short-lived, and you just keep doing that from one crisis to another. So there should be a change from this. There should be more long-term approaches, looking at the root causes and more inclusive and coherent ways of addressing this. There's also the issue of the divide between relief and development, or emergency and development, because in many of these countries where the country started to transit away from crisis and to rebuild itself, money doesn't go where it's supposed to be, so that this country construction would build on the way it should be. The divide between the two, relief and the construction or development phase, is very big in many cases, and this is exactly where the revolving door sits, where people go to find nothing, and they recycle themselves into other movements that goes into different directions. We are also seeing humanitarian responses or operations, if you wish, that are underfunded, overstretched, and receive no attention. We often speak about forgotten humanitarian crisis. And for God's sake, if they are forgotten, you should not be surprised if you see people coming out, because there's very little to keep them in, and because many of these camps and IDP settlements, they became recruitment grounds for human smugglers.
Again, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to move on to Ms. Frawley, and perhaps you can say about, and we will come back to you, I'm sure, in Q&A. I'd like to leave some time for Q&A. We're actually kind of closing in on that time. So if you don't mind, we move to Ms. Frawley, you can tell us how would we do as volunteers, as Red Cross workers, as individuals? What can we do on a personal level?
That's exactly where I feel most comfortable addressing, which is just about that one-to-one contact, that personal contact, that conversation that you're having with your neighbor and with the folks in your neighborhood. I see that a change of attitude and a change of heart is needed, and I think that it starts with us. And it starts with me, and it starts with everybody that's I'm in contact with, to be able to open up conversations, to be open to differences in culture and sensitivity, and to realize that that we're one person helping the next one. So I think an individual, I think we saw a lot of that initially when people were moving north, that people met them at the train stations, that people are still opening their hearts and meeting them at the train stations, providing food and water and shelter. And I think it's going to have to start with that from us on the ground. So I'm quite happy to be a part of that here.
She's the opposite of academics. She's a woman of few words and much and a lot of action. We talk a lot and don't do anything about it. I'm a person very guilty on this. But we'll try to tease more out of her in the Q&A. Yes, hold on for 1 second. I know you're eager to ask and they're eager to respond. And I'm really again sorry, Mr. Nour, to cut you off because I know it's a very big topic and I have a lot to say about it. But it's just the time limitation does not allow that. So what we will do, if you don't mind, if you can introduce yourself briefly, just say your name, don't say no more, and then raise your hand. And then what we'll do is that please address the person you're asking the question to, or if it's for the panel, you can say for the panel. So that lady over there has her hand up first. Then and remember, as my teacher once said, if there's not a question mark in front of what you're saying, it's not a question.
Hi, my name is Sheila Katzman. I'm a retiree of the UN, peacekeeping. I will first of all applaud everything that you guys are doing. Really tremendous work you're doing. My question is, I just came back from, I was in Turkey last year and in Greece in October, working with the caregivers, psychiatrists, psychologists, volunteers who are working with the refugees. I met and spoke with many of the refugees. What I'm wondering is if the ICRC or any of you on the panel doing anything to help, and maybe Ms. Frawley can talk about this, how it affects you as a person and as a caregiver, because what I found as a person doing intervention in this area is that the caregivers were coming down with high blood pressure and all sorts of other thoughts, even though they want to give. And then there's that relationship because, for instance, where I was in Greece, between the police and the volunteers who are working with the refugees. I have much more questions, but I want to leave it at that.
Thanks for the question. I think a beautiful run along the East River this morning, watching the sun come up and remembering what it was like to be on the boat was a refreshing moment. So resiliency and MSF, Doctors Without Borders, has mental health workers both in the field and outside of the field. So we have that opportunity, like you do, to be able to share and care some of our experiences. I think the strength that we all get from having that person in crisis in front of us to be able to not necessarily have their solution, but to help point to their own solution for what's going on is the key for people to be healthy and happy. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, I will not have the perfect response to it, because I mean we have, of course, not just speak of the ICRC, because we're, for example, in Greece, we're not running a psychosocial program, but I know that a number of national societies, for example, Italian Red Cross, I think they do. I think that in Germany, the German Red Cross, they run these programs, psychosocial support for, well, let's say them called migrants. However, and that's probably an interesting one. If I take the ICRC ourselves, we do have a unit of psychosocial support also for our staff, our teams. But it is true that generally speaking, I knew it much more myself. I spent years visiting prisons, and it can be very traumatizing doing that every day and seeing terrible things and coming out. And so these are things that don't leave your mind. But we always had good psychosocial support if we had a violent incident. There, immediately, everybody's taken care. The teams are trained to do it. But we have much less actually a practice in addressing the sort of, trauma or weight that this kind of encounters daily has. There is to a certain extent, but not as systematic probably as it could be. And while there is some, I think that many organizations don't actually do enough in that area. So that's a bit of an honest reply on that.
I was thinking about the police. I think I've seen recommendations from a number of organizations about the kind of training. I mean, I think the police, the border officials are pretty overwhelmed and not trained to deal with the kind of influx. I'm sure you saw that in your own work. And so I think there's an obligation on the part of government officials too to ensure that their own people, their own officials are trained to be able to deal with these in ways that are, that are protective of people's rights, and also are better trained to recognize certain vulnerabilities in a population like this, right? So I think that's another piece of it that really needs more attention, and needs attention from the responsible governments too.
So I know this is your chance to.
When does it?
Well, I
Get back to the
think,
rest of what you were saying before I agree with you.
well, thank Sheila for this very helpful question, because it would allow us to shift focus from the numbers to the human dimension of the issues that we are dealing with. And in this specific case, we are looking at more specifically the vulnerabilities that are there. And they could be many. And when it comes to health and the situation that some people are in, I think it is important to emphasize that medical care and assistance should be the top priority. Referral to who could provide that service would be important, and to prioritize these cases for protection or resettlement.
Lorraine Haber, and I have a question, most specifically for you, Mr. Elmer, but and somebody else can chime in. I've been wondering, I like what you said about the long-term approach and the fact that you don't like just fighting crisis to crisis, looking for root cause. Are there predictive indicators that can be looked at so that there's better planning to deal with some of these responses? It seems that all the things that happened were taken by surprise. We didn't see quite this kind of migration with Iraq. Suddenly with Syria, we saw not only a migration, but then it ramped way out of proportion to what we might have anticipated. Are there indicators on the ground that can be tracked that could give us better advance warning that could be more effective planning?
Well, this is an interesting shift in the thinking that we need to have dealing with the crisis and moving away from firefighting approaches to more systematic and coherent ways of addressing the issues. And I think today we have an opportunity to do exactly that, thanks to the adoption of the 2030 Development Agenda, which for the first time includes migration-related targets and goals. And one of them specifically, this is target 10.7, emphasize the importance for countries to develop well-managed migration policies that would facilitate safe, orderly, and humane and responsible migration. And it has very interesting linkages with other goals. For example, goal 10, which speaks about reducing inequality, because in many cases, inequality and poverty is the driver of people who look for better opportunities elsewhere. There's also targets that about, societies that are peaceful. So there is a need to look into not only the response to the conflict, but the conflict prevention agenda needs to be relegated in terms of importance, because always, the prevention is more effective, and less costly than the treatment. So I think my recommendation would go along the lines of recognizing that the movement of people, migration by and large, is not stoppable, can only be managed and managed well. And if it needs to be managed well, then we need to look at the drivers of migration. We need to look at areas where there are high probabilities and push factors that push the people out, and see how through development that would give opportunity, particularly to the youth, to stay where they are and start to have a hope that where they are, they could build their future. So I think that agenda has to go hand in hand, development agenda, if you wish, with human rights-based approaches, but also with measures that is needed to exit from this protracted humanitarian crisis that's seemingly going on.
In fact, the distinction between the current refugee crisis and some of the previous ones, like the Cuban case or the Vietnamese case or the Iranian case, is that this is much more protracted and it's a civil war and a sectarian war. So the writing is pretty much on the wall. All you need to do is watch BBC News every night. And in fact, the question is, why are more people not leaving Iraq or Syria? My partner's mother, who's been left the country since the war broke out, she talks to the neighbors, just wondering what happens with the apartment. And the neighbors say there's no water, there's no electricity, there's no food, you know, I mean, why would they not leave? And so I think that it's sort of like, so the question is that why didn't we rise up to the occasion in the first place and prevent it from getting to where it is, which is some of the issues that Mr.
No, I didn't stress that.
I think, I mean, for me, yes, and the answer is whether there's the will to do it, right? But and you were just making me think, you know, if you look at where a number of refugees were, whether it was Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, if you look at the requests for assistance to help them, it was only 50, not even, was it something like 57% funded, right? So you had food rations being cut, people aren't able to legally work, people lose hope, as you said, and then they move. And how could we not see that coming? How could you think that if you're not supporting people well in the countries of first asylum, that they're going to do what they have to do, as you would, to provide for your family? And so, you know, it really has to be the will to act. And I guess I always do want to remember, I mean, I think it's important as it is to focus on what's happening in Europe, and as morally obligated as all the governments are, and we all are, to address that situation. We always want to remind people that most of the Syrian refugees are still in those neighboring countries, that themselves have a number of issues too. And so, you know, you have Lebanon with what now 1/4 of its population being refugees, struggling to do the right thing too, right? And so we're needing assistance anyway to do the right thing. And so I think we have to remember that at the same time that we're talking about how to best deal with the European situation.
Yeah, that's it, telling, because the vast majority of these refugees are in the neighboring countries, not in Europe, not yet.
Hi, my name is Joan, and I'm a volunteer from the Greater New York Red Cross, and also a volunteer from the Venezuelan Red Cross. I have two questions. The first one is, who's in charge to say that any situation is becoming or it is a humanitarian crisis? And the second one, from the point of view of the ICRC, what actions can be done in these particular cases of countries where there is no war, there is no, you know, like this media situation well known by the whole world, but there's certainly things that are becoming major trouble for the citizens of those countries. For example, in my case in Venezuela, it's not a humanitarian crisis as usually we think, you know, it's not a war, but people is migrating, people is going abroad. In my case, I have no friends that there. Some of them in Spain, Colombia, any other countries, you know, most of them are professionals. We don't feel safe. What actions can be done from the point of view of the ICRC to make some improvement and make some changes in order not us to leave in our country and become migrants?
Okay, not an easy question, because I mean you could say I mean there is not one qualifying body in the world who says this is a humanitarian crisis. That I mean you would have various institutions taking their judgments on it. I mean it's like for the ICRC and different institutions look at these things always sometimes from mandates or their job descriptions. But of course, like say the ICRC, I mean, we do look, where is there an armed conflict? Where are there what we call other situations of violence? Usually it comes to violent situations that resort something, and then we will be seeing humanitarian issues that are arising, humanitarian problems, and if they take a scale, we might then call it ourselves a crisis. You see within the sort of UN system as well that they have established different levels, even on different types of mechanisms, when they suddenly will proclaim a level 3 sort of emergency where the whole sort of UN institutions have to then work and so there are certain criteria when it becomes big, and also we have these kind of criteria. Different organizations will be then addressing it. I mean, the issue, if you're taking like your country you're speaking about, I mean, every organization like ourselves, we will be looking at sort of areas where we can address them and find responses to them. Obviously, this will also always depend in various countries to the degree that states will let you do the work. And we see it in armed conflict situations. For example, the ICRC, when two states are fighting, it's usually easy. The law permits us actually to go in. When it becomes we call it an internal, non-international armed conflict, well, usually the ICRC, it's quite well established that we play a role, and generally speaking, we go in, but there are cases where even that can be a problem. When it becomes to the more of situations, violence, or the countries fighting, let's say, criminality and different issues, it is very much up to the country and to really decide to what extent they want to grant that response, and have also external actors or their local actors involved. So it's not in every context as easy to mount a larger scale response, but we certainly look at vulnerabilities everywhere, and we try. And that's maybe the point I can make.
On who is in charge and who can declare a situation as a humanitarian crisis or not, it goes at two levels. The national level usually is the government that once it has a crisis situation, man-made or because of a natural disaster, and if that situation is beyond the capability of the country to deal with that, to deal with that situation and provide the necessary response, it can declare a crisis situation in the country and appeal for help. That help will come from the UN, from development partners, from other countries. So this is national. The other level is globally, and within the UN system at least, there is the emergency refugee coordinator, and they have a system where they categorize crisis as phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. Phase 3 obviously is the worst. Yemen, for example, is phase 3, Syria is phase 3, where again the international community needs to come together and help.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes left, so pressing question. Oh, sorry.
Hi, good evening. My name is Emma Rosales, and this is a question more for the whole panel. It's twofold. One being, well, I was in Turkey during maybe 2-3 years into the war, and even up to about 6, maybe 8 months ago, I saw that there was always, obviously the Syrian population, which was one of the many populations that are going through and going all the way around to Europe, is that Turkey doesn't have a very strong kind of integration, like in regards to social services, like for example, education. The places that I do know of Turkey having much better education for refugees are in Diyarbakir, all the way in the east. But most of these people are going to Istanbul because, of course, that's like the main city where a lot of people think that they're going to find jobs. But even amongst the city and different types of districts throughout Istanbul, you would just kind of see them begging. And even when I was trying to look for work for nonprofit organizations within Turkey, they weren't very developed to deal with Syrian refugees or to try and help them. So if most of the refugees are passing through Turkey, or a lot of them, but not really staying, they go to Europe, from what I had spoken to some of them, thinking that because they have family members there or because their family members did so well in Europe and not in places like in Turkey. Do you think that the budget that was allocated last year in December coming to January by the European Union to give more money to Turkey to try to kind of really assess the situation, to give, in a way, buy Europe time, because Europe is not sufficiently large enough to deal with all these refugees, and Turkey being a lot larger than, say, Slovenia or Macedonia or Croatia, to kind of really have that budget? Do you think that it's going to be sufficient or more effective than maybe 3 or 2.5 years ago when Syrian refugees and other refugees were going into Turkey? And second of all, I'm curious to see, is the IOM, when they're talking about resettlement, would it be a possibility to maybe perhaps resettle a lot of these Arab-speaking populations into South and Central America, being that Central and South America have had such a great success at actually truly integrating Arab culture
within South and Central America, for example, Palestinians in Peru or Ecuador, and many of these countries in South and Central America have accepted a lot of the refugees.
Could you keep your remarks brief, please?
Well,
Since the question was long, then the answer will have to be short.
Well, the first part, I would answer it by making 3 points. The first point is to recognize that Turkey's policy, which is based on an open door approach, welcoming, assisting, and providing protection to the refugees is very much appreciated. The result of that, because it has been going on for quite some time, more than 3 million refugees from Turkey from Syria ended up in Turkey. Obviously, the burden of that is huge, and that is why we started to see people going beyond Turkey. And one of the push factors for people to go beyond Turkey are 2. One is education, because most of those who come from Syria, the education capability is on Arabic language. So, and that is a language that is obviously hard when we go to the schools. It's not the medium of instruction in any of the refugee schools. So this is one push factor, the lack of education, especially to the young Syrian people, and that there is no Arabic possibilities to teach them in Arabic. The second is the jobs. Because jobs are large. Syrian by nature, many of you may know that, are entrepreneurial and they are very skilled. The education system has been really working well in the country. The average level of education is high school or even beyond. So these are people who can easily become productive, but the possibility of doing something in terms of livelihood in Turkey is limited. That is why the European response now is trying to come with a hybrid way of approach that would include humanitarian assistance, as we know, life-saving basically, but also a resilience-based approach that would focus and prioritize on education and on job creation. And that is why we see agencies like UNHCR, but UNDP, they recently have launched the Senior Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan. This is the document that went to the London conference on the 4th of February, and there's a large number of pledges that has been made. In terms of resettlement, and IOM could facilitate Syrian resettlement, I would say, to non-traditional countries. I think this is now the hope. UNHCR is going to organize on the 30th of March in Geneva a meeting or a conference that is called Resettlement Plus. And the Plus talks about the other legal avenues for Syrian refugees to get humanitarian visas, to get scholarships, family reunifications, sponsors. And many of these would be, the hope would come from non-traditional countries, Central America, and many places in Latin America, where people from both Syrian and Lebanese origin, they have been there, many of them in second or third generation. Some of them became residents in this country. So this is indeed the hope that we do more, and we see more generosity coming and more what we call responsibility sharing that is coming from it.
Okay, we have actually reached the end of time, but we have time for perhaps one last question. I think this gentleman has the hand up, and then you could come personally and ask a question.
We will not kick you out of here.
That's correct, Josh? There will not be all night long.
In fact, I urge you not to sort of exit right away.
You know, one last resort of anything like this is to stick around on my side.
We take you to your work, Josh. Thank you very much. My name is Christophe Louis-Boulanger, International Delegate with Red Cross, American Red Cross, but also family with International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent. Thank you first of all to the chapter for hosting this webinar and for monitoring me. You've done a great job. I think it was very informative. It's important to stress first of all the enormous constraints that the humanitarian organizations are working on. Politically, We are basically at the mercy of the European Union, getting back together, and other entities. In terms of security as well, our hearts are right now with the families and with MSF, who's lost two of the workers in Malachi, in South Sudan. We exemplifies also the tremendous work that humanitarian organizations are doing. Also, it's important to stress that for the European national societies, both the Red Cross and Red Crescent, they have ramped up their activities tremendously to a scale that was unknown before. They were not accustomed to dealing with refugees and migrants at that level before. I just came back from Germany. Germany has welcomed 1.2 million refugees in a year time. And the Red Cross, the German Red Cross, is extremely instrumental in welcoming those. And it really exemplifies the tremendous work that the volunteers are doing with the Red Cross National Society in Europe. You were mentioning history before. It is important that it could be very useful to stress history even further and repeatedly. For instance, Syria was the country, the welcoming countries for the Afghan conflict, was the welcoming countries for the Iraqi conflict in 2003, 2004, 2005, and so on. They were the ones welcoming people, and now they are the ones leading. At the European level, it is important that the first UNHCR emergency operation happened where? Happened to welcome 200,000 Hungarians fleeing from the Russian occupation. And so history can be a very important tool in this. One question, quick question for Philippe, and one question for Timoney. Can you speak perhaps a little bit about the central work of the Red Cross in Europe, which is addressing the dignity of whether they are migrant or refugee, because the dignity of those who are undergoing this tremendous journey is quite central to the work of the Red Cross. And then for Madame Timoney, I know that European governments are receiving assistance in addressing the gender issue from the governmental level, in teaching the population which are arriving about gender and about what to do and how the way women are being addressed legally, but also socially speaking, culturally speaking, is different from those in the country they're coming from. And perhaps you could speak about it shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this sophisticated question. Too bad it's at the end of the night, not in the beginning. So I asked again.
Well, I mean, on the question of dignity, I mean, I think that, you know, as a Red Cross, and if you're speaking about principles, I mean, the dignity part really comes from the first of the 7 fundamental principles of the movement, which is linked to humanity. And that's why in the entire policy, also in the migration policy, it was very much spelled out in what I mentioned, that one had to look first at the vulnerability. It is the geste humanitaire. I mean, that all the volunteers are really asked to approach the people from their diverse needs and the needs really first. And that's why I mean, Mr. Nour, he pronounced it as well, that all the legal and all the distinctions are necessary, but still that very fundamental principle of how we deal with the people there as humans and the dignity is the foremost message which we have to all the volunteers in the various types of responses we have, as varied as they can be, and as different types of activities they can be, from the psychosocial, from the way one receives people, you know, coming off their boats. So that is really the thread that goes through the entire movement response. And hopefully, of course, one would hope that all the humanitarian responders, even outside the Red Cross Red Crescent movement.
So I can't really speak to it tonight in the sense that we were looking at people who were moving in our first missions, looking at people who were moving quickly. I may have a better answer for you when our team comes back from Germany and Sweden, because they may have seen instances of what you're talking about. But it really does get to how do we well support people to successfully integrate in the communities in which we're welcoming them. So maybe we should be in touch in a week or two. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There's been a tremendous discussion and exchange. I'd like to thank all the panelists, thank Josh, thank Marie, and thank also Michael here who's done a lot of work here.
I didn't talk to my own
Well,
city.
it's our duty.
I see that.
We didn't seem to get enough of discussion on refugees in Europe, refugee crisis. In 2 weeks from tonight, exactly the same time, at the CUNY Graduate Center, we have a panel on EU migration and asylum policies in the wake of the refugee crisis, issues and responses, including 4 ambassadors from different European countries. I have a bunch of flyers for you. If you get here quick, you'll get the color ones. And I urge you to stick around and talk to the panelists, talk to each other. I often tell my students, don't go to these functions just to hear lectures. Stick around, meet people, network, and it's really encouraging to do that. And also, there's still some.
Hi, Jillian. Sorry, just copy from you. I don't know.
Hi there.
How are you? My name is